In today's video, we're going to cover everything you need to know about pawns and pawn structures, and we're going to cover them in the chapters listed on the right hand side there. So we're going to start off with the basics with pawn islands. And pawn islands essentially are these sets of pawns that you have. So in this case, white has 2 pawn islands and black has 3 pawn islands. 1, 2, 3. What's crucial about pawn islands is pawn islands can be weak, because the more pawn islands you have, the less likely your pawns are to be able to defend each other. So for instance, if you take white's position, white's pawns can protect each other pretty well, however they arrange themselves. Whereas black's pawns, let's just take that to the beginning. Black's pawns will only be able to defend, you'll always have 3 weaknesses in black's position in the pawn chains, whereas in white's position you could end up with only 2 weak points. And you think this is a very small aspect of the game and it's not really going to matter, but it actually it just increases the chances. If you've got more pawn islands, your opponent has more weaknesses to attack. So if there were some pieces on the board, or even if there's just kings, in this kind of a position, black has 2 weaknesses, and once these weak points fall on b6 and e6, the pawns on d5 and a5 quickly become weak as well, whereas white's only real weakness is that c2 pawn, and I mean, if you want to count that h2 pawn as a weakness as well, everything else is very well defended. So that's the first concept we're going to cover, pawn islands. Again, if this was, let's say, like that, again, it's 3 pawn islands for black. This one's a little bit of a bigger pawn island over here in the center. But then black has what is called an isolated pawn, which we're going to get to in a moment. But first and foremost, we needed to cover pawn islands, and now let's move on to chapter 2. So what are isolated pawns? Well, as the name suggests, isolated pawns are pawns that have no pawn on either side of them. So they are isolated from the pawn chain. And the reason that's important is when they're isolated from the pawn chain, no other pawn can protect them. And if no other pawn can protect the pawn, it is a weakness. So this is a classic isolated d-pawn structure. This happens in so many games of chess because a lot of chess openings involve the c and e pawns getting traded off, either by white or by black. And that's why we're going to look at this position as a starting point. You'll be guaranteed to see this type of position in a lot of grandmaster games and just a lot of club level games. Even in your games, you'll come across them, just depending on what skill level you're at. Isolated d-pawns. So the punchline with isolated pawns is they are weaknesses, and so you've got to really be careful when you trade pawns not to end up with isolated pawns. As a general rule, as a rule of thumb, you want to avoid getting an isolated pawn. If we were to add pieces to this board, let's just add rooks, right? So we'll add the kings as well. If this is a rook endgame, again, it's a relatively equal position, but black has an eye on this pawn at all times, and white's rook or white's king needs to be right next to the pawn to defend it. Whereas black's pawn structure, again, we're looking at pawns, right? Black has 2 pawn islands and white has 3 pawn islands. And that d-pawn creates a weakness that black can exploit. White's plan with these types of positions typically is, if there's more pieces on the board, white wants to either push that isolated pawn forward and trade it off. So let's just say black's rook was here, or let's say here. White wants to trade that weakness off and get rid of that weak isolated pawn. Black, on the other hand, does not want that pawn to advance, and so usually would plonk let's just add a couple of knights here, would plonk a knight in front of it. The reason why you'd put a knight there is it's pretty clumsy to put a rook there. You don't really want your rook, one of your best pieces, to be performing a defensive duty, and also the rook is better off on the back rank where it protects the back rank, connects with the other rook. It's for fun, let's just add a couple more rooks to the position. And so naturally a knight is usually the best blockader of an isolated pawn. Again, white wants to play for a push with that isolated pawn for two reasons. One is, and we're just going to add a few more pieces again. Let's just say white has a bishop here, and black has the bishop here. And white has a queen here, and black has a queen here. In this type of a position, again, white's main idea is to push that isolated pawn for two reasons. One is to get rid of the isolated pawn and get rid of that weakness, but the other one is to open the lines for his pieces. So by moving that pawn forward, you free up that d4 square for pieces like your knight, and you free up the diagonal for your bishop. So in a position where white ends up with an isolated d-pawn, again, we're just going to play with this d-pawn example to start with. In an isolated d-pawn position, black wants to blockade the pawn. And again, if you think about this, now becomes a pretty bad bishop because it's blocked by its pawn, and that pawn cannot move. And that's a very strong knight on an outpost in the center of the board. So black wants to blockade it, and white wants to either sacrifice it completely and create a weakness for black. Let's just say the knight couldn't take it. Let's say the knight was here, and so the pawn on c6 took it. So white wants to push that pawn in most cases. Now if we go back to an endgame type position, just with the pawn skeleton on the board, that's what we want to look out for. That is what an isolated pawn is. And this is one more example with some bishops on the board. And let's look at, again, the pawn islands and the isolated pawns. So black has 2 pawn islands, and white has 1, 2. This is one big pawn island, 3. So white has 3 pawn islands and 2 isolated pawns. Let's take a look at that a4 pawn and see how it is actually a weakness. That pawn on b6 stops it from going forward because it'll be taken. And that bishop on d7 turns this bishop on c2 into a purely defensive piece. So again, it's a pretty equal position overall, but the concepts are black is the one who has the pressure here. And if anything else, white's got to watch out for that h2 pawn as well, because that king might be able to come up the board as well and get into a position where the king is threatening the pawn on h2, the bishop's threatening the pawn on a4, and after a few pawn moves and maneuvering, black is the only one who could get an advantage out of this position because of white's weaknesses. The computer even says this is 0.2 in favor for black, or negative 0.2. So there you have it. That's isolated pawns in a nutshell. They are generally weaknesses. You can turn them into assets if you do have them. I mean, if you can't avoid it and you end up with an isolated pawn, you want to turn it into an asset somehow. And it usually involves sacrificing it and pushing it forward. But there you have it. That's isolated pawns in a nutshell. Let's move on to the first bonus. Okay, bonus number 1, hanging pawns. So these are the close cousin or stepbrother or half removed niece, or whatever you want to call it, of isolated pawns. Hanging pawns are essentially 2 pawns that are next to each other with no pawns on either side. So they're very similar to isolated pawns. It's like 2 isolated pawns that actually sort of, the fact that they're next to each other, they don't even defend each other. And usually they get blockaded by the opponent's pawns. So they end up sort of suspended in midair, which is, I guess, where the name hanging pawns comes from. because if you move one, it gets taken, creating an isolated pawn, and if you move the other, it gets taken, creating another isolated pawn that's far advanced in the opponent's position and risks getting taken. I'll show you how these structures come about. So this is a typical kind of Queen's Gambit type game. So let's go from the start. These are just sample moves, but you can kind of get the gist of how this position comes about. Any sort of Queen's Gambit systems where you got a d4 and d5 pawn, and white plays b3, and once black plays c5, either side here can get hanging pawns, depending on who wants to take the pawns in the center. So if it was white's move, white could play c takes, c takes, d takes, b takes, and black has the hanging pawns. Or let's go back and say, instead of taking on d5, white plays queen to e2, and then black can transpose to that position where white has hanging pawns. So are hanging pawns weak, or are they strong, or what are they? Well, they are considered a bit of both, and that's the tricky thing about them. They are an imbalance in the position, which means one side plays with them, one side plays without them or against them. Essentially, if you have hanging pawns, you want to maintain an aggressive, not overly aggressive, but you want to maintain the initiative. You want to be the one attacking and putting the pressure on the opponent, because when you have them, it usually means you've got more space than your opponent. As you can see, white has more space in the center. You've got more central control, and your pieces, once your rooks come to these files, so let's just say it's black's move here, black moves and puts pressure here, white does the same thing, maybe black moves the queen, and white moves that rook, black moves that rook. Once the rooks are in position on the open files, black for these open files, C and D, because they're actually open, and white because he wants to support the hanging pawns. The plan here would be for white to time a move like d5. The computer actually says it's the best move in this position, full stop. The reason for this is when, again, black can't take this because that bishop's hanging, but when this happens, white, again, similar to isolated pawns like that isolated d-pawn position we looked at, white's pieces start gaining a lot of scope for attacking the opponent. The lines start getting opened up. And again, it's a very committal thing to play d5, so white's not going to play it, or black if it was the opposite way around. Black's not going to look to play it instantly, but they will look to do it as their main plan in the position. So white might even play moves like trying to put pressure on h7 with a queen and bishop battery. Maybe white's going to move that knight to e5 or knight to g5. And black is going to try apply pressure as much as they can, and just black is on the defensive here until white commits and plays d5, and then let's just say white plays d5 here. Black has moves like knight c5, because now that c5 square is an outpost, and if white takes here, black can take here, and white ends up with an isolated c-pawn, which black can attack with moves like bishop to h6, bishop to a6, and you got that battery on the c-file, the major piece battery. So these are some of the nuances that happen with hanging pawns, but it's an important structure. It happens like we saw in this sort of miniature game. It happens in a lot of the d4, d5 openings, a lot of the Queen's Gambits, a lot of the Queen's Indian defenses, a lot of the Nimzo Indian defenses, and it's a similar position to isolated pawns in a way. What white doesn't want to do in this position is play c5, not because it loses a pawn, but because, I mean, obviously it just loses that pawn. But even if black couldn't take it, that pawn on c5 doesn't really do anything for white. It doesn't create any sort of advantage in the position. Whereas a pawn, let's just say this happens, ignore that hanging bishop on e7. If this happens, black's bishop is cut off. Black's knight cannot go on that d5 square anymore. That square on d4 is opened up for white's knight. And if you think about it, white's always going to be threatening this d6 move just to open up that square for the knight even. And it's going to be hard for black to get his queen and his rooks to defend the king side, because this pawn sort of halves black's position. It sort of cuts black's position in two. It's almost military-like when you look at it. You're sort of attacking right down the middle and separating the opponent's position, or not necessarily directly in this position, but you are very close to creating a position where your opponent is split into two sides. And sometimes even if you lose that pawn as white, opening up those lines, similar to that isolated d-pawn situation, is very beneficial. So this is hanging pawns in a summary. And again, if we look at the skeleton, it's usually something like this. Very, very easy to conceptualize it when it's like this. It can happen with other... it can happen with pawns on other parts of the board. So you might even have pawns on e5 and d5, and you might be missing an f pawn and a c pawn. But this is the most common by far, because you can kind of see how quickly it comes about from a d4, d5 Queen's Gambit style opening for either side. So there you have it. Bonus 1, hanging pawns. Moving on to doubled pawns and tripled pawns. As the name suggests, doubled pawns are pawns that have been doubled up on top of each other. So white has two sets of double pawns and black has one set of double pawns here. In general, doubled pawns are considered a weakness. In this case, black has isolated double pawns and white has isolated double pawns here. The reason they're weak is because these pawns, let's just say black's pawn, the alternative would have been if black's pawn was on b6. That creates a really healthy pawn chain. But on c6, these pawns cannot defend each other, and they're just going to be weaknesses for the entire game. And there's close to nothing that black is going to be able to do about them, and white's going to have close to nothing that they can do about these ones. On the other hand, these isolated pawns can be good or bad depending on the position. The reason they can be good is this is a pretty stable pawn structure. The problem with this type of a pawn structure is white has a bunch of light squared weaknesses, or likewise if black had a similar one. Black is very, very exposed on those dark squares. Usually the plans in this kind of a situation become getting a rook onto that open file. So sometimes, let's just say we go back to this type of a position. Sometimes white's going to welcome, let's say white has a knight here. Let's give black a rook, let's be nice. White's sometimes going to welcome, in a middle game, not an end game, this type of a exchange, because white is then going to apply pressure with maybe a bishop on c3, a queen, maybe doubling rooks, apply pressure on that g7 square. So that's a plan. So this type of a doubled pawn structure isn't horrible, especially when there's a pawn next to it, but when they are isolated and doubled, it's horrific. So now let's take a look at tripled pawns. This is the ugliest pawn structure I've ever seen in my life. And it just sort of happens. This is how quickly it can happen. It is so rare, so you don't have to worry about it too much. But if you have managed to find yourself with tripled pawns, you have done something wrong. That's I'm saying it as a joke, but it's pretty true. Like, how do you end up with tripled pawns against your own will? Probably the quickest way it can happen is d4, e6, c4, bishop check, knight c3, takes, and then c5. And then usually white would just let this let this be, maybe play knight f3. Black is never going to take this because it just undoubles white's pawn structure here. But if white decided to take here, then we get the fabled triple pawns. Black's probably going to continue something like this. But yeah, essentially these pawns are weaknesses for the entire game for white. Black is probably going to, after knight c3, just win that pawn back. Probably secure that knight, maybe even b6 actually. And that bishop could come to a6 at some point. That rook's going to come to c8. So yeah, punchline is you don't want to find yourself with triple pawns, but it was a fun example to look at. Have we missed anything for this? I think that pretty much covers it for doubled pawns. They're generally weaknesses. Avoid them as much as you can. Keep your pawns in a nice, smooth sort of chain like this as much as possible. But there's sometimes merit in doubling up your F pawns and opening up that G file. And sometimes, like you saw in this example here, where is it? In this example here, you just can't avoid it sometimes because black is just going to double your pawns that way. But the good thing is you just leave it, and at some point the tension will get resolved, and it's just one of those things. One of those pawn structures that will pop up in your games very commonly, so you want to get comfortable playing with isolated pawns. Rather, one of those pawn structures that's going to happen in your games often, so you want to get comfortable playing with doubled pawns. Now we get to the fun part, passed pawns. I feel like it's been a lot of doom and gloom with the last ones with double pawns and triple pawns, but this is where it gets fun. Passed pawns are essentially pawns that have no opposition pawn that can challenge them. So in this case, white has a passed a pawn, and it's passed meaning it can reach its queening square without obstruction. So if black's pawn was on b7 or b6 instead, there are no passed pawns in this position, but with the pawn on c6, that becomes a passed pawn. And the reason passed pawns are so important in chess is because they happen in endgames and they win endgames. They don't win every endgame, but you have the chance, you create chances to win endgames by creating a passed pawn. So a lot of chess, as it moves on from the middle game to the end game, is all about who can create a passed pawn first. How am I going to create a passed pawn, and how can I push that pawn and support it until it's a queen? That's essentially what passed pawns are. There's not much to it. How can they appear? Well, this is a fun example actually. This is the hanging pawn structure that we looked at earlier. With a lot fewer pieces on the board, supported by rook, white could, in this case, or white's plan in this position, could be to create a passed pawn, and then get his king up the board, possibly even to c6. That rook's going to support the pawn. This king wants to get to d6 to block the pawn from moving any further. But that's essentially what white is going to be playing around, probably trying to get to that kind of a position. Or if we go back, how we talked about hanging pawns, you want to push them at some point. Even if white had the rook on c1, so let's just say something like that, this is even better for white because it's just a little bit further to the queen side and further away from black's king and king side. The further your passed pawns are away from the enemy king, the better. So the best example is if we go to this example, that a pawn. So in a lot of games, a passed a pawn wins the game for either side. So that's why this one's close to my heart. I've won a lot of games like this. It's one of my favorite strategies. You get from the middle game to the end game, and you turn that into a queen and win the game that way. So there you have it. That's what pass pawns are. They win games, so make sure that you create pass pawns in your games as long as they're supported, right? So you don't want to push your pawn all the way up to the enemy position and then lose it. So for instance, if black just gets his king here and white just keeps pushing aimlessly, well, white is just going to lose that pawn. So you want to make sure that your pass pawns are protected and supported, but whoever's got the pass pawn has the advantage most of the time. Nice and easy, pass pawns, nice and fun. And now we move to chapter 5, backward pawns. You must be thinking, man, how many different types of pawn structures are there? Well, this is another one. So backward pawns are, that's the backward pawn right there, d3. Backward pawns are pawns that have sort of been left behind. If you think about that natural pawn structure, that pawn wants to be either on d4 or d5. But the fact that it's on d3 and its companion pawn, the one on the left-hand side, has moved up the board, that d pawn can never be protected by another pawn if it wants to get to that d4 square. And since white doesn't have an e pawn either, that becomes a weak square essentially in white's position. Black is usually going to try to put a knight in that position and put pressure on that d3 pawn. So backwards pawns are weaknesses. Again, a lot of weaknesses in these types of pawn structures, but this is why the best types of pawn structures are, these sort of very nice, no weakness, no doubling, no isolation, no backwards pawns, just standard healthy pawn structures. If you end up with a pawn structure like this, your opponent is going to put some rooks on that d file, put pressure on it, maybe get a bishop on that h7 b1 diagonal, maybe get a knight onto b4 and put pressure on it that way, maybe a knight from c6 jumping to b4. And essentially, yeah, that's what a backwards pawn is. What black is going to want to do in this position to play against it is, let's just say white plays king f1. Imagine there's more pieces on the board, but this is just the skeleton. One of black's plans is to just play e5 and really lock that in so that white cannot, because white's going to want to, the way white gets rid of that backwards pawn is by, let's just say black wastes some time. White's going to play d4. And white no longer has a backward pawn. And white has a centralized king or knight or whatever piece ends up in that position. To prevent that from ever happening, black can play e5, clamping down on that square. And if black had a knight on c6, black could get it to d4 on that nice outpost, and then just continue applying pressure on this d3 backwards pawn. That's essentially what backwards pawns are and why they're weaknesses and how to play against them. And you might be thinking, okay, well, they probably don't happen too often in games, do they? Well, funnily enough, they do. One of the most popular openings in chess is a Najdorf Sicilian. So this is the main line. And knight c3, a6, which is the Najdorf. And if white plays the main line, which is bishop to e3, black has two options really, e6 or e5. And e5 is probably more popular nowadays. And when the knight moves, black ends up with a self-inflicted backwards d6 pawn. And as play continues, essentially what black's plan is going to be to get a bishop to e6 and try support that pawn push up. And that gets rid of the backwards pawn for black and takes white's crucial e4 pawn out of the game. And even if black is unsuccessful in pushing that pawn to d5, it's always going to be something that could happen later on in the game, because that pawn's actually decently defended by that bishop, which will likely end up on e7, queen on c7. That rook, once the king castles, can come to d8, and it's a pretty safe pawn. It restricts white's play as well, and it's just, this is one of those openings that backwards pawns naturally happening. But in this type of a situation, you do not want to be intentionally creating a backwards pawn for yourself, because similar to this position, white now has an outpost for his pieces. Again, timing is everything. White can never play that right. White cannot play that right now. He'll hang that e4 pawn. But it's just one of those things, right? It sometimes works, sometimes doesn't, but it's usually a weakness, so try to avoid it. And there you go, backwards pawns. Nice and easy again. Well, we are now up to the second bonus. And just before we get into the second bonus, if you've made it this far into the video, surely drop a like, maybe even subscribe, and I'll see you in the next videos as well. But the second bonus is this pawn structure. And a lot of you might have already seen this before, but if not, this is what happens when you fianchetto your bishops. So earlier in the game, you would have played g3 and played your bishop to g2. And likewise, your opponent might have done the same thing, thereby fianchettoing the bishops. So with these types of pawn structures, with the bishops fianchettoed, let's just take this one out, and let's just say black is the only one that is fianchettoed. So the thing about these pawn structures is, as soon as you move that pawn to g6, it weakens the f6 and h6 squares. So the two plans that you're going to want to do against these types of structures, if you're trying to attack, if you're just trying to play a symmetrical game, just go ahead and play a symmetrical game. But otherwise, if white castled queenside and had a rook down here in h1, h4, h5, take, opening that h file. That's the main plan for white if white is trying to play an aggressive game. And just for fun, let's just add a bit of shelter around that king and maybe that pawn on d3 instead. Just for fun, let's just mix it up. And let's just give black a rook as well. The other thing white is going to want to do is, so let's give black a queen now, since we're giving white a queen. White's going to want to get rid of that bishop. Now, if black trades, black's in real trouble instantly because he's going to get checkmated. But what that does, getting rid of that dark squared bishop, essentially just weakens that h6 and f6 square complex, the dark square color complex, even more. So black's usually going to want to drop that bishop back, but that's essentially what you want to be playing as white, or as the aggressor, against a fianchetto type of structure. So against that type of pawn structure. On the other hand, it's actually a really safe pawn structure in general. So all that stuff aside, all the rook sacrifices and pawn sacrifices and all the kind of sacrifices aside that lead to exciting attacking chess that you usually see, it's actually a very stable pawn structure, and a lot of white's openings, a lot of openings in general, revolve around getting a fianchettoed bishop. So sometimes, if white played knight f3, which is the Reti opening, they can follow up with a g3, maybe even a c4, turn it into an English defense. So you get a lot of these types of positions, or even if it's a, let's say, you could do a double fianchetto. That's usually pretty good. These are very safe, solid pawn structures. You're not really going to get checkmated unless somehow you get rid of that, you trade that light squared bishop off and just end up with a very weak pawn structure, or you end up starting to move this pawn as well. Let's just say this happens, and now let's just say these get traded off. These squares become pretty weak, so white has to be careful when playing. Also, there are other openings like the Indian defense openings, like here black can play d5, which is the Grunfeld, and after something like this, white gets a strong center, but black applies a lot of pressure to it. And that pawn can become a weakness very quickly. So we've got a couple more chapters to go, and then we are through with the basics of pawn structures. This topic is going to be pawn chains, and this is essentially what a pawn chain is. A pawn chain is a string of pawns that sort of point like a connect four. It doesn't have to be a connect four, of course, but just when they're connected like a chain and pointing in a certain direction, that's typically considered a pawn chain. So there's a couple examples I want to show you guys, and we'll go over how to play pawn chain type structures in a nutshell. Generally, by nature, there's a lot of pawns on the board still in order to create a pawn chain, and so positions with pawn chains are typically closed positions or semi-closed positions. So this is an example of the French defense. It's the main line closed variation. So e4, e6, d4, d5, e5, c5, c3, and we've got this pawn chain where white's pawns point towards black's kingside, and that typically, this is the key thing, typically dictates that white is going to follow up and try essentially continue that pawn chain by playing f4 and f5, creating strong pawns next to each other here, and even possibly f6, because that pawn chain creates a whole bunch of space for white behind the pawns on the center and the king side. On the flip side, black is going to probably not play c4 because it closes up the position, and then black is the one who's going to get attacked on the king side. Black is probably going to take this at some point and continue expanding on the queen side with moves like b5, b4, a5, maybe even getting a pawn to a3 and then opening up the position that way, getting a knight onto c4, playing on the queen side. So these pawns point towards the king side. Black has more space on the on the queen side to be playing, and is more cramped on the king side. So black is going to be playing on the queen side and creating pressure on that c file, as is typical in French defenses. So this is another pawn chain closed position. This is one of my favorites growing up. I used to love playing this as black, actually, and as white. It's one of those positions that's fun to play either side. Can anyone guess which opening this comes from? Drop it down in the comments if you can, but this is essentially how we get to that position. It's a King's Indian. It's a mainline King's Indian, or maybe what used to be a mainline King's Indian. Typically, this is how the game starts. It's a pretty long line. The knight comes back here, and then white drops his knight back, black drops his knight back, white gets his bishop out, black, again following that pawn chain line, black has more space on the king side, so starts the attack on the king side. White prevents black from ruining his center, and then black closes up that position and plays something like g5, or instead of g5, black can play a5, which stops white's natural move. So if black played g5, white could play b4 and then c5, right? Because white's pawn chain points towards the queen side, and white's got space on the queen side to maneuver. That's typically how play could go. After g5, maybe you could see a h3 followed by an h5, and then black's plan is essentially to get the knight to g6, maybe the other one knight back up to f6. A bishop sacrifice on h3 is always on the cards, and possibly even a rook lift, either moving the rook to g8 and then the pawn to g4, or keeping the rook on that f file, maybe going up to f6 so that it can swing across any way, and still have pressure on the f-file. And this is looking like one of Hikaru Nakamura's analysis boards right now. So I'm going to stop right there. But that's essentially what pawn chains are and what you want to look for in your games. They tell you where you want to, which side of the board you're going to want to play on, and which side of the board you're going to be strongest in. And now, last but not least, Chapter 7, Pawn Majorities. So what pawn majorities are is when you have more pawns on one side of the board than your opponent. So in this case, very symmetrical, or not symmetrical, very equal type of position. You can see the D pawns have been traded off, and then the C for the E pawn has been traded off. This results in a pawn structure where white has what's called a queenside pawn majority, and black has a kingside pawn majority. Now, why these pawn nuances are very important to know is because when you get to the endgame, generally what you want to do is you want to get a passed pawn, right? Because we looked at passed pawns earlier. To get a passed pawn, you need to push your pawn majority forward and trade into a passed pawn. And thereby, you create chances to make a queen and win the game. Now, can black do that on the king side? Absolutely, black can do that. Black can do the same thing on the king side. But the fact that most games involve kingside castling means, hang on, I left the pawn here. The fact that most games involve kingside castling means the kings at the start of an endgame usually begin on the king side. And so if you have a queenside pawn majority, and remember, halfway through the game, after the middle game, these pawns might be like this, for all we know. It is much better to have a queenside pawn majority because you are more likely to be able to convert that into a passed pawn that's a threat. So in this type of position, white is going to essentially play a4 and b5 and then trade down to a passed pawn. Not instantly, because you need to support your passed pawns, right? Your king should be somewhere close by already, but that's the concept. That's what you want to do with pawn majorities. Now let's take a look at a slightly different example. This is with the c2 and b7 pawns removed. This is an even more extreme pawn majority because it's 2 versus 1 rather than 3 versus 2. The only thing more extreme than this is if you take these off and it's 1v0, and that's a clean passed pawn. So you can kind of see, right? Process of elimination. You get to a passed pawn with a queening square of a8 or b8. In this type of a position, even though it's equal material, white's the one who's probably got the advantage because white's just going to continue moving his king up the board. Black's going to have to respond to that challenge, and then white's going to push those pawns up. And the trick is once white trades these off so that it's just, let's just say the position gets to something like this. The thing is that king's always going to be tied to the defense of that pawn. So white is going to start pushing on the king side themselves. And after we get to some sort of a position like this, white is going to you guessed it, start taking black's pawns from this side. And make a queen. And black's just not in time with his pawn, and he's going to lose the game. That's why pawn majorities are crucial to know about. And then you also need to know how to formulate a plan as you get from the middle game into the end game to turn that pawn majority into a passed pawn, and then turn that passed pawn into a queen and win the game. And that essentially sums up everything we needed to cover today. That's chapter 7 done and dusted. Before I end the video, I just want to say thanks to everyone who made it all the way through. If you haven't subscribed already, please do so. There's more content coming and there's more content on my channel, so check it out. Drop a like as well. Share it with your friends, share it with your family, share it with your husband, wife, brother, sister, mother, father, everyone. Everyone you know, just freaking share it on Facebook, share it on Instagram. No, but in all seriousness, I hope you got something out of this video. In my opinion, it covers all the basics of pawn structures in one video. And so, yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Peace out. Good luck on your games.